Okay, excellent. Well, yes, thank you to everyone who's taken time from your evening to join us. I'm delighted to be here. I am a huge fan of ALTA and your association, and I have tremendous respect for what you do as academic language therapist, the specialized and highly credentialed training that you all have gone through in order to obtain that certification, and really, more importantly, the life-changing difference that I know you are making for each of the children that you serve and the important work that you are doing each and every day. So as Samantha said, my name is Lorraine Hightower, and like many of you, I am passionate about serving students with dyslexia. For over 10 years now, I've been advocating locally. I live in Loudoun County, and I've been advocating at the local level to affect systemic change regarding teacher training. And I've been advocating across the state for important legislative efforts that would make a difference for not only students, but teachers who are well-intentioned and know they don't have the training they need in order to serve these students. And I've been able to have so many important conversations with parents and teachers and administrators and even community members like pediatricians and, as we said, our elected officials. And what the common denominator always is that people really don't understand how common dyslexia is and how many of our kids it affects, and that it affects our students to varying degrees. And unfortunately, how unprepared our public school staff is to support and educate these kids. So as Samantha said, while I have enjoyed the journey, my hope tonight is that as a result of this conversation, as experts in my mind, certified academic language therapists, you too will leave this conversation with some ideas on how you can help the families and the community that you live in and make an impactful difference beyond that one child that you serve. And I just want to say I'm totally comfortable with you all asking questions and interrupting me as we go, because I want this to be, a presentation that you find value in, that is interactive. But, my journey, and Samantha and I were talking beforehand about how she got into becoming a certified academic language therapist because of her own family struggle. My story is very similar. And over 10 years ago, my own son was in the public school system. He was in first grade, and his teacher told me, he's one of the smartest kids in the class. He's a great problem solver, but something's not quite right. He might have ADHD. And my husband and I were like, well, what first grade boy isn't fidgety? So we decided, I see Samantha kind of nodding. Yeah. We decided not to do anything at that time. And then he went on to second grade, and he was lucky enough to have a teacher who had 30 years of teaching experience. She actually had a special education background. And she said to me, Jonathan is a bright and capable and, engaged student, but something, is not clicking for him in basic areas of reading and writing and spelling. And with your permission, I would like to refer him for a special education evaluation. And we said, oh, absolutely. You know best. You're a teacher. We want to do whatever you think he needs. And I will never forget the shock of sitting in that child study meeting at the time and watching the rest of the team, who were not teachers, completely not endorse this teacher's recommendation. And, comments were made that my son is he's not a behavior problem. He's a really nice kid. And his counselor even said, well, we see him in the cafeteria and he engages well with his peers and he's well behaved and he's polite. And in fact, she told me, if you put a special education label on your son, you will always regret it. And it almost felt a little bit uncomfortable at that time. And what I have come to find out is not only was it critical that I put a special education label on my son, but that after over 5 years of hiring ineffective tutors and well-intentioned retired teachers, it was critical that I find someone who was qualified to provide my son with effective and appropriate multisensory structured literacy to close his personal gap. And I'm pleased to tell you that he's now a sophomore in high school and he's doing, just fine. But of course he relies on his assistive technology and other supports. But I have lived the journey that so many of you, I imagine, have, because we come to this work through kind of a broken road. And it's by realizing that a lot of what is in place is not working for our kids. And our kids, of course, don't represent a small portion of the population. They can be 2 to 4 in every classroom. So I want to give, some context for those of you that may not be as familiar to what services actually look like in the public school system. And to start, for students who have dyslexia, more than mild dyslexia, but dyslexia to the point that it really impacts their access to the general education curriculum and prevents them from making progress towards the grade level curriculum, there's a process that they go through to be found eligible for certain supports and services. And those services can include everything from specialized reading instruction to important accommodations, like not being called on to read aloud or being asked to go up and write spelling words on the board. And it can include certain assistive technology supports and other related services like speech language therapy, occupational therapy, and even executive function support. But too often, as an advocate, what I find when parents reach out to me is even if their child has met the criteria to have an IEP, an individualized education program, which is under education law, or even a 504 plan, which is under civil rights disability law, we find that the specialized reading remediation that's in place is not evidence-based or research-based to be appropriate for kids with dyslexia. And we find that some of the accommodations are actually stigmatizing and are leading to social and emotional harm to that student. Whether it's they're supposed to use their speech to text in the classroom in front of everyone else and show what they don't know, or they're supposed to, in virtual learning right now, they want these kids to be able to type back to the teacher in the chat without a speech to text feature. Well, for many of our dyslexic kids, that's just not possible and is very kind of self-identifying, self-stigmatizing, and can lead to some social and emotional harm. Or it could be a situation where the public school is saying, we're a one-to-one device type school and all of our kids have laptops. So in essence, they all have assistive technology, but not really fully understanding as a school team how that might look and how much more effective that assistive technology could be for a student if it was their personalized laptop that was already preset to all of their personalized settings and shortcuts for them to use their font, their speech to text, their preferred style of communicating and showing what they know towards that grade level curriculum. And as we said, other services that might be appropriate. So too often, I think our parents who have kids with dyslexia and maybe working with you as therapists, they really don't know, who to trust. Should they listen to the public school? Is what they're, recommending or proposing in that IEP or that 504, is that appropriate for a student with dyslexia? So I do spend a lot of time having conversations with parents, kind of guiding them and helping them navigate this process so that they don't, buy into and give consent to ineffective remediation, accommodations, or services. So I'm just going to keep going, Samantha, unless there's questions, if that's okay.
No questions, yeah, please.
Okay, perfect. So that's kind of how students, as we said, can be supported in the public school setting. And of course, there's always challenges. With every good intention, there's some unintended consequences or unintended outcomes that can happen. And what I see most often in the public school setting is that services are not agreed to by the IEP team. So for example, a parent knows that their child is dyslexic. They have the school data, they have the private data, maybe they've gone out and gotten a private evaluation, and they've even got recommendations from the private doctor that say, this student should have multisensory structured literacy, and they'll say with an Orton-Gillingham approach or using this approach. And the school team will just kind of discount that and say, well, we use corrective reading decoding. And so that's what we're proposing for your student. And, if parents don't have an advocate or potentially an attorney, they're really none the wiser on should they agree or not agree to that service. And then, what I also see is they don't understand what is an appropriate implementation model. What does that intervention look like when it's being delivered with fidelity? And I'll give you all a great example, because right now with the pandemic that we're all trying to find our way through, many schools, some are very well intentioned and they say, we know this student needs this curriculum and it should be 90 minutes a day. And prior to COVID, that's what they were providing. And the student was making progress. But now that school boards have decided that the instructional day for all general education kids should be reduced, these same school teams are reaching out to parents and saying, oh, even though we agreed, 6 months or a year ago that that's what your child required, we're now only going to be able to do 30 minutes twice a week. So they have, in a sense, changed the fidelity model for that evidence-based methodology, which now no longer is evidence-based when you're doing it 2 minutes, or not 2 times, 30 minutes each. So I'm seeing this happening every single day in many different school districts. Or, I think the ALTA audience can appreciate this challenge more than anyone else. You have teachers who, they're very well intentioned. They've gone to their undergraduate program. They've graduated as reading specialists, and they don't know what they don't know. And they haven't been taught a curriculum that is based on the science of reading, and they don't understand, the benefit of using a multisensory approach. Or perhaps their district has said, we're going to send you to a 2-day professional development on seeing stars, so you can now use that with your students. And I see too many, unfortunately, well-intentioned teachers who don't even realize that they lack the appropriate qualifications to make a meaningful difference for those students. And we're going to talk later about how I think you all with ALTA can help with that effort. But again, another challenge that I see each and every day is ineffective progress monitoring. Too often in our public school setting, schools will do an initial evaluation with one set of assessments, and then they will put goals in place. And sometimes they will say how those goals are going to be measured. And oftentimes they even forget to say how they're going to measure these goals. But let's say hypothetically, they've done an evaluation where they've given a norm referenced diagnostic assessment for decoding and fluency and comprehension. And then they write a goal that they're going to progress monitor with teacher data and running records. And, that's not really comparing trend data or apples to apples to see if the student has really made meaningful progress. So those poor families are quite shocked when they find out a year later at that annual IEP, oh my goodness, if we've asked them to use those same diagnostic measures a year later, that child maybe hasn't made any progress. And of course, this is, after I've become involved, but I just want to share some of the challenges and acknowledge and be very transparent that while I work as an educational advocate in the public school system, I am well aware that for families who don't have an advocate or attorney, that these challenges exist. And if you have students that you work with in the private school setting, well, private schools can be a wonderful alternative for students who have dyslexia. Families do need to know that they are kind of giving up any type of federal protection. So when you're in a public school setting, if those public school or private schools don't accept any federal funding, then those students have kind of put their federal protections for any type of educational rights or disability discrimination rights kind of on hold. And even, with my own son, we had to pull him out of public school for some time, and he was in private school. And he was in a great private school for a couple of years. And we did that because, unfortunately, since he didn't have the supports and services he needed, he became pre-suicidal. And so in an effort to put him in a safe environment and let him realize that it's okay to be dyslexic and you're going to be okay in the long run, you just need to get the right kind of help and the right assistive technology, that was a wonderful alternative for him. But even in that fantastic private school that told us that they offered reading remediation, what we came to find out is that they had 8 kids in one class with a teacher. And while she was highly qualified, she was trying to differentiate that reading remediation for all 8 of those kids in one 45-minute block 3 times a week. And so, unfortunately, that's not an ideal model for our kids who need appropriate, intensive reading remediation delivered with fidelity. So even when kids are placed in a safe and comfortable private school where their social and emotional side is whole, there still might be the need for outside or appropriate reading intervention.
Lorraine, I have a question that might come up perfectly here.
Yep.
It's when appropriate in your talk, will you address how a dyslexic student can get daily one-to-one year-round skilled therapy for a few years so that they can become independent at an age-appropriate level? She says, I've been contacted by schools, but they are not willing to authorize the level of service needed. So I think this is from Susan Loughton. I think
Yes. Hi, Susan. Yeah.
either both public and private are
Yes.
not willing to allow the level of service needed.
Yes, and we are going to get into how that decision making happens in just a few minutes, but I will
Okay.
say that when you're trying to advocate for a student who does need year-round intensive, highly qualified intervention, unfortunately, that is not something that school teams just come out with and offer. And their rationale for why that is the case is because of the federal special education regulations that, to use the car analogy that's often quoted in case law, and I have to disclose I'm not an attorney, right? I'm an advocate. But in case law, they will often say our obligation is to provide a Chevy, not a Maserati. So when you're talking about a Maserati, that looks like year-round, daily, appropriate intervention.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will also say in some of the most egregious cases where harm has truly been done to a student, that could very well be the remedy, but that is often as the result of parents pursuing dispute resolution options. They most likely have had to file due process. The burden in due process is on the parent. So the parent has to be able to show the harm that the school district has caused to that student. And then they have to be able to convince the hearing officer that the remedy for that is year-round, one-on-one, highly qualified intervention, for that student. So I don't know if that answers the question, Samantha. I'm happy to
Okay, I think so.
follow up.
We have another question from Jill Bender. She said, do they have evidence-based remediation programs in Fairfax or Loudoun County, and what are they? I only hear about Wilson in FCPS for lower elementary schools with dyslexia.
Yes, so both Loudoun and Fairfax have kind of woken up, I'm going to say, to the expectation that their students are underperforming. And when I say underperforming, the national reading scores, not just for the entire country, because it's true for the entire country, but for Loudoun and Fairfax just showed dismal and declining reading scores, not just for students with disabilities, but for all of our students. And I shared with Samantha earlier, I was on a call today with professors from University of Virginia, with Delegate Carrie Delaney out of Fairfax, with Delegate Glenn Davis, because they are working at the University of Virginia, and as legislators, they said there's a lot of traction right now around reading. So that is the good news. Now, to answer your question, Jill, what is happening in Loudoun and Fairfax? So in Loudoun County, they tend to want to offer an Orton-Gillingham approach that tends to be based on the recipe for reading. So they have put over 2,000, I think it's almost like 2,500 of their teachers through different levels of training. And the standard that they use is about 30 hours of Orton-Gillingham training that is taught by the Institute of Multisensory, IMSLAC. I'm sure I'm getting the acronym wrong. And then they use kind of a train-the-trainer model, and they have coaches in Loudoun County. They actually call them SIFARs, or Specialized Instructional Facilitators of Reading. So those individuals, I do find, know what they're talking about. They know what an appropriate intervention plan should look like for a student. But again, the decisions for that student's intervention plan are based on data. They're based on present level performance data. They're based on diagnostic data. And schools, public schools, are not necessarily committed to providing a Maserati plan for that child. So they're committed to providing enough intervention to close that child's achievement gap to the point that they can move meaningfully towards their IEP goals and make progress towards their general education curriculum. Now in Fairfax used to be a lot more transparent, and they actually used to have a specialized reading matrix that they would put out, and it had all these columns. Some of you may have seen it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very good, I thought. It was very transparent for families, and it said, hey, if you have a student with dyslexia, it even had an asterisk by certain reading remediations and said, this is evidence-based, research-based to be effective for kids with dyslexia. And it would classify these interventions as tier 2 or tier 3, and it would even offer the appropriate intervention model in another column for what school teams should have their IEP teams implement if they had a student who had this, this profile. Unfortunately, while Fairfax does have a, certainly qualified dyslexia specialist, what I see happening in Fairfax is they're going more towards the Loudoun County model, where they're hoping to train a certain cohort of teachers and more of a general Orton-Gillingham methodology. And I don't really oppose this as long as they know how to use that methodology. But what makes me nervous as an advocate for kids in Fairfax is that once you take away the packaged program, if you will, that has built-in, baselines for entry points of where that student should start the intervention, and then unit mastery checks. You're, as an advocate, I can educate parents on, this is the program, these are the mastery checks, this is how you follow along, let's make sure we ask for X, Y, and Z, and if that's not happening, we want additional data points to show mastery of this, content knowledge. So when school districts start to go to more of an eclectic and open methodology, it becomes harder for parents on their own to know, is this appropriate? Is this going to allow for meaningful progress? Are they targeting the right skills? Should we be talking about decoding when we have phonemic awareness concerns for this student? So there's all kinds of things that can now happen if we move away from a more prescriptive specialized reading intervention model.
Nancy wanted to also add about Arlington County. Are they following the same as Fairfax and Loudoun?
So Arlington has actually set a bar, I have to say. I don't do as much work in Arlington, Nancy, but I will say that I've been very impressed with what I have seen and heard from a distance with Arlington, in the sense that they have embraced the science of reading curriculum, and that they have a cohort of parents who are very strong advocates who are asking for certain methodology to be used for these kids in the public school setting. And I think that as a district, because they're small, they have a much stronger knowledge base, qualified knowledge base of what these interventions should look like, and that they're doing a better job of getting their teachers trained. Arlington actually had Dr. Kelly Sandman Hurley from the Dyslexia Training Institute out in San Diego. They brought her out to do an audit of their school system and their teacher training and their intervention models. And I trained under Dr. Kelly Sandman Hurley, so I have great respect for her. And she told them, here's where you're missing the mark. Here's what you're doing that is on track. Here's what you need to do. And they really embraced her recommendations. So I've just seen so many positive changes in Arlington. But to be, very honest with you, I don't have a lot of families in Arlington that I support. I tend to work mostly in Fairfax, Loudoun, Frederick County, Fauquier County, kind of that neck of the woods.
I have another question from Melissa. Is progress monitoring an official process that has guidelines and rules?
So that's a great question, and unfortunately, the answer is no. I'm going to say no in the world of ALTA, right? So there are, in terms of IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So for students who have IEPs, yes, the district does have to report on progress for those students towards their IEP goals. So, but the requirement is pretty small. It says, basically, the regulation says that for students with disabilities, the school must provide progress data at the same rate that they report on progress for all other general education students. And that's 4 times a year when they send out quarterly report cards. So what ends up happening, again, when parents don't have someone else like an ALTA therapist or an advocate involved, is they have to wait for the whole quarter to get that IEP progress report, which, if you've ever seen one, unfortunately, doesn't contain a lot of information. They use in most school districts, they use a numerical system of 1 through 5. Is this child making progress towards their IEP goal? And they don't necessarily provide detailed, specific data on what their fluency has increased, from this starting point to this starting point, or they were not able to decode, syllable types that looked like this, and now they are able to decode those syllable types. So unfortunately, parents need to know that they need to ask for very specific progress monitoring data of their school teams to really ensure that their kids are making meaningful progress.
We have one last question from Jennifer. What specific programs have you seen in FCPS and LCPS? Is there anything besides Wilson Foundations?
Sure. Yes, I've seen a few. So in Loudoun County, as I said, they don't actually use, well, I'm just going to call them packaged programs. I don't know what better term to use, but they do invest in professional development of this cohort. Now it's over 2,000 teachers who get ongoing professional development training from the Institute of Multisensory Education, model, or using that model. In Fairfax, they're moving towards that model of more of an Orton Gillingham based eclectic approach. But I do have clients whose kids are in language foundations, or they are in language exclamation mark, or language live, or they're in Wilson. Some students are, I'm trying to think of the other, I don't know if it's the letters program, but most of my students are in foundations, language live, language exclamation mark. Those are the ones that are popping out right now. But again, we rely on that matrix.
Right.
I hope that's helpful. Any follow-up questions on that? Okay.
No, there was just one last thing from Susan who just wanted to clarify. It's IMSE is the training.
Thank you, Susan.
Yes, because IMSLIC is the it's such a small difference, but IMSLIC is the accreditation process that we go it's very difficult. But IMSE is a different program.
Right. They're the educational arm, and then you're saying IMSLIC is more the certification arm. Is that right?
Yes, the accreditation are programs that we are trained under are accredited through IMSLIC. Yes.
Yeah, and that's perfect for the next portion of this presentation, because what I want to move into is talking a little bit about how parents can and should advocate for their student, and then we're also going to lead into what I think the ALTA therapists can do to help put a more effective plan in place for the students that they're working with, outside of the school system. So I have to start, because I don't know who's here in the audience or what your knowledge base is. I have to start by saying that if you're working with a student and you know that they have disabilities and they're in the public school setting and the parents haven't taken action or don't know what action they should take in order to see if their student qualifies and meets the criteria for, as we said, a educational plan under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is more of education regulations, or if they meet the criteria under Section 504, which is more civil rights disability regulations. It all starts with a official referral to the school district about those parent concerns. And too often I talk to parents who say, well, I told the teacher that I have these concerns, or I talked with the principal and I said, my child is at least a year behind in reading. I'm not sure what next year's teacher is going to do differently, but they haven't actually made a formal written referral to the school district that says, I suspect my child has disabilities, or I know my child has disabilities, and I'm writing to request that the school district evaluate my student and determine if they meet the criteria for more formal education and accommodation plans. And that is a critical first step, because what parents will find when they make that referral is 9 times out of 10, it leads to a comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation. So I tell parents, when you're making that referral, it's really your formal request for data from the school district to tell you what are your child's present levels. And almost every advocacy conversation has to start with that data. So the referral is key, and that's what I would tell any families that you're working with. If they say, I feel like I should get an IEP or a 504, do you know what I need to do? They need to reach out to the school's special education designee, which can be the assistant principal, special education dean. In some cases, it is the principal, and they need to say, how would I make a formal referral for a comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation? Because I suspect my child has disabilities. And then from that initial referral, what happens in the public school setting is if they agree to evaluate, the school district has 65 business days to conduct that evaluation. And they will conduct an evaluation on the cognitive abilities of that student, the academic abilities of that student. But again, if you are working with this family and you know they're going through the evaluation process, I would encourage you as therapists to say to that family, make sure the school district assesses orthographic processing as well as auditory processing and phonological processing. Because what I see too often is they don't assess orthographic processing. And then we come to find out that while that child has strengths, you know, that were not orthographically based, they performed very well on the school, or not, you know, they performed well, but not poor enough, let's say, to meet the criteria to have a formal plan in place. So once the referral is made, the school district will evaluate, and then that leads to a conversation on eligibility for that student in that public school district. And I don't want to spend a lot of time, unless there's questions, I'm happy to do so, about eligibility. But suffice it to say that eligibility is a two-prong decision. So families who know that their child has dyslexia, that alone is not enough to allow them to get an IEP or a 504 plan. What school teams are going to be looking at is, does that disability prevent them from accessing and making progress in the public school curriculum because there's evidence of underachievement and it's linked to a processing disorder? Or when we're talking about 504 plans, they're looking at, you know, is this a major life activity like reading that substantially restricts this student to the point that they need certain accommodations? So sometimes parents think, oh, I got the private diagnosis. I'm going to go to the school and they're going to roll out the red carpet for me. And they're surprised to find that they actually have to prove that underachievement, and they have to prove that there's a connection to that processing disorder, which is why I'm mentioning, you know, make sure they also check orthographic processing.
Okay, so I don't know if anyone can hear me or if Lorraine is still with us.
Hi, this is Melissa. Lorraine
Melissa.
just had a power outage, which knocked her out of the meeting, but she is on the generator and she is going to pop right back in.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Can't plan these things, can we?
I know. I know. You just never know.
No.
While we're on here, Melissa, I wrote her name wrong. It was Kelly Salmon Hurley. I will email you her information. Sorry, my computer keyboard is up high, so my typing was wrong there. She's from the Dyslexia Institute in Dyslexia Training Institute in San Diego, I think. Well, while we're waiting for Lorraine to jump back on, we are waiting for somebody to volunteer for treasurer position. We have a nominee for secretary and for president-elect. So if anybody would like to join in for the board next year for the treasurer position, that would be great. Let me know.
I just spoke to Lorraine again, and her internet is shoddy coming
in. Oh, no.
But she is trying to get back in, and
okay,
we will not need to reschedule if you guys can hang in there with her for a couple more minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Melissa. I know it's stressful.
Oh, there she is. No problem.
Am I back with you?
You are. Hooray.
You know what, Samantha, I was just laughing to myself. I'm like, this is what it's like to have a student with disabilities, right?
Right.
You know, when you think you have a plan in place or you think you've got everything. Let me just try to share my screen while we're talking. You never know what curveball you're going to be.
Never know. Yes. Flexibility is the name of the game for sure.
It is. So let me just see if I can pull this up. Are there any questions on what we were just discussing while
no questions. We're all set.
All right. Well, thank you guys for being so patient here. I'm sorry. We live in Western Loudoun, and often what happens is we are well, not often, but with this week and the high winds and the weather, there we go. So let me just get here and I'm going to get us right back on track. Okay. So I think, weren't we just talking about the referral? We've gone through the referral process. We're talking about eligibility, and we were talking about it being a two-pronged decision and how it's based on criteria. And I think that's important as therapists, just for you to be able to caution parents that a diagnosis alone doesn't necessarily guarantee those students an IEP or a 504 plan. But, you know, it may very well mean that they still need one. So, and here, you know, I have this, I love this picture because this is how I view those ALTA therapists. You all do have the power to help these kids. And you also have, in my opinion, the expert knowledge that many people around the IEP table or the 504 table or what have you, the school table, again, not that they're not well-intentioned, but they just don't have the training that you all have, and they don't know what they don't know. So I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about how I feel the ALTA therapist who's working with the family and jump in and ask me questions if this part isn't clear, the role that I think you could and should take to support the students that you work with. So again, another plug for you guys being the expert in the room, even if not everybody around the table acknowledges it. I don't know of any other tutor, teacher, or therapist who meets the high qualification target that the ALTA therapists have to meet. So I want to start by saying that, you know, I think the ALTA therapist should be invited to all school meetings. And I want to say everything from the child study, the initial conversation, to the eligibility meeting, to the IEP meeting. And, you know, parents are sometimes surprised when I suggest this, but I mean it sincerely in the sense that as long as parents give you permission as that child's academic language therapist to be a part of the school team discussion, because the school team will definitely want them to give you permission to share confidential information about that child, I firmly believe that you should have a seat at that table. If you, even if you've just started working with that child, because I know as an educational advocate that you've already done some important baseline testing with that child, that you can speak to strengths and weaknesses, that you can help challenge in a professional way what the school team may or may not be saying or doing as they're preparing to assess that child. So I want to make sure that everybody on this call understands that you can and should have a place at that table if that family has entrusted you with providing the reading remediation for that student. And you can participate at all levels. Sometimes teams will say, oh, well, they don't need to come to the child study or the local screening committee meeting. You know, we can, if your child's found eligible, we can bring them to, you know, the IEP table. But I would encourage your parents, you know, not to agree to that. Because again, everything is happening virtually right now. So I was in a child study meeting this morning, and the administrator for the school team said, well, you know, we got some teacher reports, but we're actually not able to get teacher ratings for some skills because in the virtual setting, the teachers really don't have access to the kids. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting to hear. I hope that the eligibility team will keep that in mind as we move to the eligibility discussion and weigh the parents' input and the private tutors' input more than the school input if the teachers do not have direct access. So it was kind of, you know, it was good that they admitted that they don't have access, but it's also a reason why I think that even at the child study table, if you are working with these kids on a regular basis, maybe virtually one-on-one or in person, but you already know what their baseline levels are, that's an important piece of data to share at the child study table, because it's or local screening committee, it's very possible that that student's English teacher has no idea what their decoding, reading fluency, comprehension abilities are. And you can show up at that initial meeting and talk about your role as a private therapist, any assessments you've already done, what your initial concerns are, why you're there with the family and believe the school district should do additional evaluations, and continue to serve in that role through the rest of that child's special education journey. And I just wanted to make sure that the therapists, while they may not want to do that, I realize not everybody, not everybody's like me, Samantha. They don't live for eligibility and IEP meetings, but I do attend a lot of these meetings with the support of the private tutor or therapist, because, one of the defining moments for me as I was trying to help my own son is, like you, Samantha, I thought, oh, I'm going to get trained and I'm going to do that remediation for him, because I was leery of what the public school system could provide. And I knew that they didn't have qualified teachers over 10 years ago, but I was not able to pass the assessment to be a trainer or a tutor. So again, that is why I always say to the families, we need to bring your child's private therapist. You have no idea how much specialized knowledge they have and how they could really change the direction of this conversation if we just get them in the room and let them share some of what they're seeing. So don't be shy about going to these meetings and speaking up and advocating for the kids that you work with. I also do think that if you're perhaps working with these students after they've been found eligible, there's a couple of different ways that the ALTA academic therapist can play a role in advocating for that student. And progress monitoring for me is one of those key ways that I believe you can be highly impactful. And again, we're talking about school teams that use eclectic measures of progress monitoring. And, my understanding is, based upon your training, you're really going to be doing much more frequent progress monitoring. You're going to be using more effective progress monitoring tools, and you're going to really be able to, if necessary, in a professional and polite way, challenge some of the present level or progress data that the school team is sharing with the parents and with the IEP team. So, to me, I think that the ALTA's therapist private progress monitoring data should also be highly considered by the school team and should be used to inform decision making. So what I mean by that is, if we're sitting around the IEP table and we're talking about goals, decoding goals, encoding goals, fluency goals, high frequency sight word, non-decodable sight word goals, what have you, who better to chime in and speak to performance levels on that than the private therapist who has all of that knowledge, right? So definitely you could play a key role in helping to shape what are appropriate goals for that student based upon their needs. How are we going to progress monitor them? And in the best situations, and I do have great stories and success stories. I know that the tone tonight is a little bit discouraging, but I have school teams where they fully embrace the private academic language therapist and they want to hear what they have to say. They work collaboratively. We actually write into the IEP under the accommodations, if it's a young child, we'll say things like personalized spelling list provided by private tutor, and that will be sent to the school. And so now that child will just be working on whatever words the private tutor said they're supposed to be working on. And that teacher has been given permission from the parent to email directly and talk with the therapist or the tutor who's working outside of the school. And it's really a lovely collaborative relationship. We're all there for the child. And in some situations, the parent will acknowledge that the child needs the IEP, but they want the private tutor. It's not a disgruntled type situation, it's more of a collaborative approach. Like, we're going to have the private tutor do all of the reading remediation, and here's what we want the public school to focus on. We want you to work on written expression. We want you to work on story development. We want you to do, math with this child or what have you. So we actually differentiate the services in the IEP, and all of that is okay. And, I just want you as therapists to know that every child's IEP, if they have one, should be individualized and appropriate for that student based upon their unique needs. And too often families hear, well, this is what we offer to kids in the elementary school, or this is the intervention that we do for students in middle school. And of course, that's not the case, because that's why it says individualized at the top of the IEP. They might have those programs and curriculums, and they may very well be available in elementary and middle school, but that doesn't mean that that is appropriate for that child, given whatever other intervention is going on outside of school, or, based upon their needs.
Lorraine, I personally have had families come to me that they've asked for reading remediation and specific programs to be taken out of the schools because they're working with me. And the school has said they can't do that because they have a decoding goal. And so they have to do that. And if they are not meeting the goal, then perhaps they don't need an IEP. And so the parent then feels threatened that they have to use the school services. And it becomes a combative situation because they don't know if they should just listen to me and just work with my program, or if they should stick with the school. So
I can speak to that, Samantha. I actually helped parents navigate that curveball, and it's a very simple solution in Virginia, because in Virginia, we are one of 4 consent states. And so what that means is that parents can give consent to certain parts of the IEP, and they don't have to give consent to other parts of the IEP. So in those situations, I help parents get the most robust IEP we can get. And then I say, don't worry, we will decide what you're going to give consent to or not give consent to when we get to that point of the process. And I can think of a student who's working with an ALTA therapist in Fairfax. She's delighted. I don't know if that therapist wants me to shout out her name, but the parent is delighted with your services. And she wanted to refuse Fairfax County's proposed intervention because she knew it wasn't going to be appropriate. So we signed that IEP in partial consent, and we did not give consent to the decoding and the fluency goals, or to the self-contained reading services. But we did give consent, meaning the parent gave consent to everything else in the IEP. And then the district does need to implement everything else in the IEP.
That's excellent to hear.
Yeah, and it's totally possible. So at least in Virginia, Samantha. So yes, and of course I have to put on here that, as you just said, ALTA's certified academic language therapists can be most effective with their teaching methodology. And in some situations, try as we might, the school team just cannot meet that mark. And if that is the case, parents have a couple of options. They can pursue dispute resolution methods, and those include facilitated IEP meetings, writing state complaints, going to mediation, in the most egregious situations, filing due process against the school district. Or they can just decide, no, I'm not going to pursue any of my dispute resolution options, but I'm going to hire someone from ALTA to help my child. And as you said, Samantha, I'm going to kind of pick and choose what I want to see happen on my child's IEP. And in some situations, through dispute resolution, the remedy might be that the district is paying for that private tutor to provide those services. And I think that was one of the questions that was asked at the very beginning. So, these journeys for kids with dyslexia who have special education supports, they are all so very different. And there's curveballs that pop up at different points of the process, and what works for one doesn't always work for the other. So again, my hope is to just kind of share with you the breadth of possibilities, so that when you're talking with your families, you know what is possible, or how to kind of guide and suggest that they kind of walk this path. And I do want to spend just a couple of minutes because I feel, this is, as an advocate, it's really important to me that we try as we might to work collaboratively with school teams, even if they are making recommendations that we know we're not going to agree to. We're very frustrated to hear what they're proposing, because as someone who has helped to affect systemic change in school districts and across the state, what I find most often is it's a lack of education. It's a lack of knowledge. It's a lack of training. They're not necessarily trying to be ill-intentioned or to harm that child. And, you know, that if we come in as advocates or therapists or parents and we're out for, you know, blood, and we're not being kind and professional or inquiring or collaborative, you know, that it really doesn't serve that family or that child. And in most cases, even if kids are in private schools, parents do have to maintain that relationship with their public school district, you know, over the course of that child's education. And that could be up to age 21 if they're super young. So many kids will, you know, go in and out, ebb and flow in and out of public and private school. So you really do want to preserve that relationship with the public school district to the best of that family's ability. And I do also say, you know, to overcome any type of obstacles with your school team, it's really important to always stay professional and not make it personal. And again, that's where I feel like bringing in a academic language therapist to the conversation changes that dynamic, because all of a sudden it's not, you know, Mrs. So-and-so won't give my child this because she doesn't like me or doesn't like my child. It's we're now looking at this with through a professional lens. We're focused on data. We're focused on what does the child need? How are we going to provide it? Do we all agree? And if the school team can't provide it, do we need an outside expert to provide it at the expense of the school district? But it really doesn't have to get personal at any point throughout that process. And that allows my families to get the results that they want without changing or damaging their relationship with their school district. And as a parent who has watched her child be harmed by a school district and then tried to help turn things around, I do think that, you know, it's important to let your families know that the faster they can forgive and focus on being a part of the solution, as opposed to, you know, placing blame and wanting people to pay, the better off their child is going to be and the better off they're going to be. And when I speak to groups of parents, I always say, you know, the 8th stage of grief is advocacy in my mind, because you kind of go through this horrible process of shock and denial and anger and sadness. And, you know, then you finally find your, you know, qualified therapist and your child makes progress and now they're okay. And then once you've gone through all of those stages of grief, you want to make sure that doesn't happen to anyone else, right? So we do want to try to forgive and focus on solution-oriented, I think, tactics more than blame whenever we can. And I also do believe, again, for the therapists that are here on the call, you know, families should be as transparent as they can possibly be. And what I mean by that is, you know, it doesn't really behoove families to be tricky and hide data or not share private evaluations or not share what the private therapist results are versus what the school team data is showing. I've never really seen a situation where acting as things are one way when they're another way, or not sharing results when we should share results has benefited a student. And again, you know, by being completely transparent, doesn't mean the family is agreeing to everything or that they're going to agree to everything, but at least we're all looking at accurate data, you know, accurate needs, accurate performance levels. So I do want to encourage those of you who work with families to tell them, you know, there's really no harm in sharing the data. And I'm going to give one caveat to that, Samantha, if I could. And that is if, you know, we're talking about something like social and emotional concerns, which right now are really rising for so many students. So I have seen situations where families really don't want to share that private information about social and emotional concerns. And there's ways, you know, to share parts of evaluations or have a private evaluator kind of redact part of that, or only share, you know, make a report for the school team with the information that's relevant to that school discussion. Because what can happen, you know, hopefully it doesn't happen, but what you really don't want to see happen in these school meetings is for the school team to switch their focus and say, oh, we have a student who has emotional disabilities or social and emotional concerns, and they don't have learning disabilities at all, when oftentimes that social and emotional symptoms are a manifestation of unidentified and unsupported learning differences. So, you know, I feel that by using some of these tactics and really using the data to advocate and invite all the experts that are involved to the decision-making table, parents can really experience so much more success and a whole lot less stress than when they're trying to, you know, advocate for their kids without the support of professionals like you all who are working with their children, you know, every day.
I just have a comment from Carla.
Yes.
I work with multi-families that would be extremely happy to have a certified academic therapist to give decoding and fluency reading goals, objectives during the school day to their child. Is it possible that SCPS and other Virginia school districts need to be persuaded that the possible therapist contracted is a way of the future? So I think she's trying to say how to get us into the schools if that's possible.
Yeah, and I've actually, you know, talked with Ellen O'Neill at ASDEC and other associations about what that might look like. And in fact, going way back, Loudoun County actually used to contract with outside experts to provide that appropriate intervention. You know, I don't know what the future holds. I sure as heck hope it does hold. You know, ALTA therapists coming in and helping to provide some of these services for students who desperately need them. I'm not sure what that looks like in the near future, but what I will say is that through dispute resolution, if a student has been harmed, and it doesn't have to be years of harm, but if a parent can use the data to show that what the district is doing is not leading to meaningful progress for that child, then the remedy can very much be that an outside expert is going to take over that piece of the intervention, and then the school team is going to deliver the rest of the specially designed services. So I hope that's helpful. But like all of you, yes, I definitely would love to see, especially for our tier 3 kids who really need prescriptive, specialized intervention done by someone who knows how to close specific gaps. I don't know that we're ever going to have our teachers to that point, you know, because teacher turnover is so high and what have you. I feel like there's always going to be a need for you all as educators and therapists to kind of fill that need. But I did want to put up here, you know, when you're talking with families, I'm always asked, well, how do you know when you should potentially get an advocate involved? So I wanted to give you a couple of scenarios on when I feel someone like me could be impactful in helping that student. And the easiest one is, you know, when a child has just been told, or the family's been told the child is just not eligible, refused to evaluate, refused to have these conversations, and the parents know that there's underachievement, there's a processing disorder, that their child should have a formal education plan. So that's definitely grounds for consulting with on a complimentary basis, or potentially hiring an advocate to help make that happen. And also when parents no longer feel heard or comfortable going to school meetings, unfortunately, I have parents who have social and emotional concerns, and they can't even, whether it's with their older children that they had to fight for years, or retaliation that they feel that they've experienced, they really can't even show up for a lot of these school meetings without taking prescriptive drugs, believe it or not. And these are, you know, these are highly accomplished professional parents who say, I've even helped attorneys go advocate for their own kids, because I think we all know when our own child is involved, our professional brain kind of goes out the window and our emotional brain rises to the surface, and all of a sudden we're not as effective as we might have been if we were trying to advocate for someone else's child. And also, you know, in situations I see too often where children who were very bright and curious and engaged in learning, you know, they now hate school. They don't even want to walk into the building, or they close down. They shut down their computer. They don't participate in the chat. They don't show up to classes. They have now generalized anxiety disorder. They have night terrors. I mean, all of this starts to happen, and the parents don't understand, you know, why is this happening, or what should we do about it? How can we make, you know, school easier? Even if they know they've got you on their team helping them with the remediation, that child is still possibly experiencing some real social and emotional harm from the school setting, or what they're being asked to do in that school setting. And another example is when the child is repeatedly being disciplined, and the school team thinks that they have, as we said, oppositional defiance disorder, and they're not seeing that it could be their below grade level reading skills that are causing that behavior. So, and I also, because of all of you, and I know how passionate you are about dyslexia, I wanted to spend just a few minutes letting you know that there's some really important bills moving through the General Assembly right now, and that if you are interested in and support these pieces of legislation, that you do reach out to your elected officials to ask them to vote yes on these two bills. The first bill is HB 1865, and that's being carried by Delegate Carrie Delaney out of Fairfax. And when you look at this as an academic language therapist, you're probably going to be like, oh, it's not, there's some loopholes here, it's not perfect, and I would 100% agree with you. But it is a whole lot better than what we have in place right now. This is a bill that basically says, if it passes, that students who have been identified in grades K through 3 who need reading remediation will be receiving appropriate evidence-based reading remediation that is grounded in the science of reading, and that it includes the descriptive words of cumulative, sequential, multi-sensory, explicit, and some parents are like, yeah, but it says shall, and it says may, and it says this, and it says this. And, as an advocate who's been working on these efforts for a very long time, I can tell you, we've never had a bill look like this before. And that if we can pass this bill, we can continue to build on this bill and just tighten up the expectations for what our school districts need to deliver, and that very well may open the door for academic language therapists to fill that need. The other bill that's moving through the General Assembly right now is Glenn Davis's bill 1947, and this is an important bill for very bright, gifted students who have dyslexia and want to have an advanced diploma, but really struggle with meeting that world language requirement. So I see you shaking your head, Samantha. I know.
It's a huge problem. My daughter was told she wasn't allowed to get wet because she couldn't take a foreign language. So that was the only reason she didn't get an advanced diploma.
I know.
They said it didn't matter.
Yeah, my son is in the same boat, right? And these are kids who test very high on the cognitive ability scale. I have so many clients whose kids are twice exceptional, 2E kids who can't get into the academies or Thomas Jefferson or whatever because they can't pass the exam or they can't meet the foreign language requirement. So Glenn Davis's bill basically says that computer coding, which a lot of students with dyslexia don't have the same challenge with mastering, that they can take computer coding, and that if they can meet that requirement, that can substitute for that foreign language requirement as part of an advanced diploma. So these are two bills that Decoding Dyslexia is pushing for, and that as an educational advocate, I support, and just wanted to make you aware of them because as busy as you all are, you may not know that these bills are moving through legislation right now. And the other thing that, as we all know, when we're advocating for kids with dyslexia and whatever role we serve, it's really not it's a marathon, right? It's not a sprint. It's this conversation, this day, this assessment, this month, this meeting, this phone call, this email. But I think, we're all in light company here, and doing something, taking action of some kind always feels better as a parent, as a teacher, as a therapist, than doing nothing at all and just kind of hoping the situation is going to get better. And parents always say to me, well, this is a lot of work. We have to go through this whole process. And is it really going to be worth it in the end? And what I always like to say is, yeah, it's not going to be easy. Nothing worth having is ever really easy. And I'm sorry that the special education process can be so difficult. But in Virginia, parents really do have more rights and procedural safeguards that they're not even aware of. And once they know what these are and they know how to use them and they know how to invite people like certified academic language therapists to the conversation, it absolutely can be worth it. And they can literally watch their child transform and change and have the assistive technology they need and show up to class and not feel so different and start to thrive in school. And I've seen it with my own eyes. And I got an email yesterday from a child that I helped, and her mom's like, I have to tell you, this was the first year ever that our daughter made honor roll. And you should just see the difference in her walk and her smile. And, she just feels so much better about herself as a little person. So it definitely is worth it. And for all of you who support kids with dyslexia, I do want to say that, I have plenty of families that I work with. So it's not that I'm necessarily, looking for additional clients, but as part of my public service, I have committed to do complimentary discovery calls and share resources with parents. I did, just as I told Samantha earlier, I send out the ALTA directory to a parent who knows she needs a private tutor. And so if you do work with families who just want to have, a 20-25-minute conversation with someone on what are their rights, what should they do, do I have any information about XYZ? It is not a sales pitch. It's just an opportunity to connect and ask their questions and get answers. And that's really the only obligation. And then if they choose to, they can subscribe to our blog, but they don't have to. Or if they find that they need, more direct hands-on advocacy services, we can consider that as well. But I should also share that I don't necessarily work with every family that comes to me, because like you all, I want to make sure that I can make an impactful difference for that child. So if it is, something where the parents really want, an outcome that I don't feel I can deliver, I'm going to let them know that, from the beginning. So I want to move into, additional questions. If there are any, I'm happy to answer anything else.
I don't see any other fresh questions. Jennifer was just asking, how does a parent prove harm? Going back to how could we possibly get into disclose? But I think you kind of answered that in terms of, it's the data, right?
Yes, it is. It's the private progress monitoring data along with the school's data. And beyond that quarterly IEP progress report, it is appropriate for a parent at any time to say, I would like additional data to be collected in these specific skill areas so that we can use that data to better inform our IEP decision making.
The Jennifer Nowicki asked, does Lorraine have advice for supporting families with children who have had IEPs for several years and received therapy who are moving into middle school? Specifically the transition from elementary to middle school, so from 6th to 7th grades. And actually I had a phone call today with somebody who's concerned about that middle school piece.
Yeah. So maybe she could give me a little bit more information in the chat. So definitely I do attend what are called transition IEP meetings, but what is her specific concern? She said that student has had remediation.
Yeah, she just said, maybe she'll add some more information. She said advice for supporting families with children who have IEPs who have already received therapy.
So I guess what comes to mind without additional information is, there's a cost to having specialized instruction provided in the public school setting. So when I talk about the cost to that student, oftentimes in middle school, they will say, well, they have to give up an elective, or they're not going to be able to have a study hall if we provide them with any type of specialized, reading intervention or any kind of specialized services. And so, it really depends, again, what are we trying to accomplish for that student? What is our intention going into middle school? Are they going to continue working with a private therapist? And we know we don't want reading services from the school, and we don't want to give up that child's elective because we want to focus on strengths as well as, weaknesses. I don't have any specific advice without knowing what student we're talking about.
She just added, what are the special education options in middle school? He had decoding skills, but still needed to achieve grade level reading.
I would say there's a lot of potential needs that a student might have transitioning out of elementary into middle school. And that could, most often I see that it has to do with written expression. Mm-hmm. I don't think as a state, we do a great job of teaching writing. And I'm talking about everything from pre-writing strategies to the actual mechanics of composing a multi-paragraph essay to how to edit or use editing software for a grade level piece of writing. I think that if I was working with a family moving into middle school, part of my process would be what are your goals for middle school, right? We have to first be clear on what are the goals for that student. Do we want them to have their elective? Do we want them to have computer coding? Do we want them to have a study hall because they have ADHD and they really need additional resource time to catch up and get their work done before, they're done at the end of the day at 4 o'clock. So we kind of would have to go through, what are we looking for? But to her point on remediation, yes, absolutely. If a student is late to be identified and they need Orton Gillingham services, or they need language exclamation mark implemented into their high school or middle school IEP, that absolutely can happen for sure.
Okay. And I don't see any other questions on there.
Okay, well, great. I know we're a little bit late. I think I've been told that about an hour is what people are comfortable with at this time of day on Zoom.
Yeah, so. We so appreciate your time, Lorraine. This has been fabulous, and you're just such a fabulous resource for us to now know and be more aware of, that your services are out there and so helpful to our families as well as to us. So we so appreciate your time.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure, and I'm sincere in telling you that on my website under resources, I have the ALTA resource, your directory, and I send that out to parents. And for any of you that might be on this call that have openings or interested in looking for new students, I really encourage you to reach out to us at, you can contact us through LorraineHightower.com. Let us know that you're out there. Let us know that you have openings, because too often families, they don't know where to turn. And then when I help tell them where to turn, everybody's full, or they're not taking new students. So I would love to know from your community, your availability as it ebbs and flows. And let's continue this, important relationship.
Great. Thank you so much, Lorraine. And thank you to everyone else for joining us.
All right. Have a great evening.
Thank you.